Good evening, and thank you for joining us at our Librarians World online series. My name is Mervin, and I will be your host for this evening's program. Now, this evening, our librarians will talk about climate change and why it is the biggest and most urgent crisis confronting the world today and its impact on Singapore. Our very first speaker, Ms. Sharon Teng, will explore the impact of climate change on the world and Singapore, as well as Singapore's mitigation and adaptation strategies. Sharon is a librarian at the National Library, and she manages the National Library's Social Science and Humanities collection. Our second speaker, Mr. Kevin Seet, will examine the current challenges faced by the global food supply chain and how Singapore is making use of technology to explore alternative food sources and mitigate these challenges. Kevin is an associate librarian at the National Library, and he manages the National Library's Business, Science, and Technology collection. And I shall now hand over the time to Sharon.
Hello, and thank you for joining today's Librarians World session. There are two parts to today's presentation. I will be sharing on climate change, and my colleague Kevin will share on alternative food sources. Our presentations are based on research from the National Library's collections, as well as credible sources online, and we are very happy to share with you today what we as librarians do in researching, curating, and packaging content on current trending topics. These are the areas I will cover in my presentation. I will discuss what climate change is, what causes it, and how it impacts us. I will also share on how Singapore's weather patterns have changed over the last century, the impact of COVID-19 on the global climate, climate change solutions, and Singapore's climate change game plan. Before we go into the definition of what climate change is, let's take a look at what some people think about climate change. Here we have quotes from former UN Secretary Generals. Kofi Annan says, "We are reaching the tipping point beyond which climate change may become irreversible. If this happens, we risk denying present and future generations the right to a healthy and sustainable planet." Ban Ki-moon says, "Addressing the climate challenge presents a golden opportunity to promote prosperity, security, and a brighter future for all." Greta Thunberg, a Swedish environmental activist who has inspired an international movement to fight climate change, says, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is." And Elon Musk says, "We are running the most dangerous experiment in history right now, which is to see how much carbon dioxide the atmosphere can handle before there is an environmental catastrophe." So, what is climate change? According to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, climate change refers to major changes in temperature, rain, or wind patterns that occur over several decades or longer. The Australian Academy of Science defines climate change as a change in the pattern of weather and related changes in oceans, land surfaces, and ice sheets occurring over timescales of decades or longer. So what's the difference between weather and climate? Is there a difference? Weather refers to the day-to-day changes in the temperature, rainfall, sunshine, and wind. Climate refers to weather patterns of a place using statistical data averaged over a long period, usually 30 years. Some people may ask, if we can't predict weather 2 weeks ahead, how can we predict climate 50 years from now? The reason it's so hard to predict the weather very far in advance is because weather is incredibly complex and dynamic. Factors like today's temperature, humidity, winds, and local geography all have an influence on tomorrow's weather. Climate is very different. We aren't looking at day-to-day details, but rather focusing on the average conditions for a region over time, and those change much more slowly. This means that it is possible to project with some confidence what the climate will be like 50 years in the future based on trends, on computer models that capture the dynamics of the climate system, and on our scientific insights into past climate conditions. Listed here are some of the international organizations documenting changes to our climate. There are many other organizations ranging from local to international, NGOs to multilateral development banks, and grassroots activists who are also fellow opponents in the fight against climate change. Over on the right is a short video message from the current UN Secretary General, António Guterres, who is calling countries all over the world to unite in tackling climate change. This slide shows a timeline summary of the key climate negotiations that have been signed to mitigate the effects of climate change. The first World Climate Conference was held in 1979, and in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was formally adopted. This is the world's first greenhouse gas emissions reduction treaty. The protocol legally binds developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. In 2009, the Copenhagen Accord was reached. It introduced a global goal of keeping warming to 2 degrees. In 2012, the Doha Amendment established the second commitment phase of the Kyoto Protocol and reviewed new emissions targets for participating countries. And in 2015, the landmark Paris Agreement was reached. This is the world's first comprehensive climate agreement and was a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. The central aim is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next, I will discuss the causes and effects of climate change. The Earth's climate has changed many times throughout the planet's history, from ice ages to long periods of warmth. What's different about this period of the Earth's history is that human activities are significantly contributing to climate change. Climate change can result from natural factors such as changes in the sun's intensity, volcanic eruptions, or slow changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun, and natural processes within the climate system. Examples of human activities contributing to climate change include carbon dioxide emissions through burning fossil fuels, methane and nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture, and emissions through land use changes such as deforestation, urbanization, and desertification. This book, The Thinking Person's Guide to Climate Change, says that there is real scientific evidence that the Earth's temperature is rising. There is a lot of data that scientists have collected which show this, such as data from satellites, ice core studies, ocean sediments, coral reefs, layers of sedimentary rocks, temperature records, land and sea ice expansion and contraction trends, growth records of native plants, and records of insect and marine animal migrations. NASA's climate change website has also identified signs of global warming. Oceans are warming up and becoming 30% more acidic. Ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctic are shrinking by billions of tons every year. Glaciers are retreating almost everywhere around the world. Snow cover in the northern hemisphere has decreased. Global sea level has risen by 8 inches in the last century. Both the extent and thickness of Arctic sea ice has declined, and extreme weather events have also been recorded. During a greenhouse effect, the molecules of greenhouse gases absorb the heat and reflect them to the surface, raising the temperature in the Earth's atmosphere and land surface. Since the Industrial Revolution, the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have increased significantly. This increase has resulted in heat being trapped inside the Earth's atmosphere, causing an increase in global temperature. Electricity production generates the single largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions, with over 60% of our electricity coming from burning fossil fuels. This is followed by agriculture, industrial production, transportation, waste management, and buildings. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists website, China is the leading contributor of CO2 in the world, followed by the US, India, Russian Federation, and Japan. According to this book, Global Climate Change, due to global warming, forest fires will increase in size and frequency, Desertification will spread, floods and more extreme rainfall events are likely, storms will be more frequent and intense with stronger winds and greater rainfall, and as a result, millions of people will end up as environmental refugees due to these climate-related disasters. Another book, Global Warming, The Complete Briefing, has highlighted the impact of climate change to these 4 areas: agriculture, forestry and ecosystems, water resources, human health, industry, settlement and society. People will be displaced from homes and there will be disruptions in businesses, transportation, and increased pressures on urban and rural infrastructures. Let's shift our focus now to Singapore's weather and how it has changed over the decades. Singapore is situated near the equator and has a typical tropical climate. We have 2 monsoon seasons each year, and it rains an average of 167 days a year. Here are some historical extremes in Singapore's weather. For example, highest and lowest rainfall and temperatures recorded over the last century. These are some news headlines of weather extremes in Singapore: highest rainfall and the hottest and coldest day ever recorded. Singapore's continuous temperature records since 1948 show that the island has been warming up, especially in the mid-1970s when rapid urbanization took place. Since 1972, Singapore has experienced an increase in warm days and nights. 8 of the 10 warmest years have occurred in the 21st century, and all the 10 warmest years are since 1997. Our annual rainfall total since 1980 has increased at an average rate of 97 mm per decade. Past climate trends for Singapore have shown an increase in surface air temperatures and the frequency of heavy rainfall over the past few decades. Where can you find climate data on Singapore? The website of the Meteorological Service Singapore produces 3 types of reports which provide an overview of the weather and climate in Singapore. First, we have the year in review. Secondly, the annual climate assessment reports. And thirdly, annual climatological reports. Reports from 2014 are available on this website. Older reports are available at the Lee Kuan Chen Reference Library or stored at the library's off-site warehouse. The website also provides historical daily records. You can find out data such as daily total rainfall, maximum and minimum temperature, and wind speed at various weather stations located in different parts of Singapore as shown on the map. Floods are a common occurrence in Singapore, usually caused by a combination of heavy rainfall, high tides, and drainage problems, especially in low-lying areas. Most floods in Singapore are flash floods that subside within a few hours and cause only minor inconveniences. But Singapore has also experienced several major floods that have destroyed property and claimed lives. There have been major floods in Singapore in almost every decade since the 1800s. These are just a few of the floods which have made news headlines. Did you know that it was raining fish in 1861? There was an earthquake in Singapore followed by a heavy downpour on 3 days in February 1861. A French naturalist and fish researcher, Francis de Castagnol, who was living in Singapore, saw locals filling their baskets with fish from the pools formed by the rain. They told him that the fish had fallen from heaven. De Castagnol believes that a waterspout in passing over a large river of Sumatra had drawn up the fish and carried them over to Singapore. According to the National Environment Agency, a waterspout occurs when a type of cloud forms during thunderstorms, creating low-pressure pockets. They are common in tropical waters and are usually spotted off Singapore once or twice a year. Reports of waterspouts have appeared in local newspapers as far back as 1908. Singapore saw its first recorded land spout on 27 September last year when winds ripped off the building roofs near Galway. An intense thunderstorm in the afternoon over western Singapore brought hailstones the size of small pebbles to the Bukit Batok area on 25 June 2013. And thanks to a monsoon surge which brought in cool air from the northern hemisphere, Singapore experienced 5 days of cool and rainy weather in January 2018, with temperatures going down to as low as 21 degrees Celsius. This was the lowest recorded temperature in the country since 2016 and the longest cool spell in the last 10 years. According to the Singapore Met Station, such cool spells could become more frequent due to climate change. Now let's talk briefly about the impact of COVID-19 on the global climate. COVID-19 has devastated the world's economy and is a global health crisis of our time. Similarly, COVID-19 has also taken a toll on the climate. Listed on this slide are some negative consequences of the current pandemic on the climate. The UN Climate Conference scheduled for November has been postponed to next year, leading to a delay in rollout of plans which addresses the climate change goals pledged at the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. Deforestation of the Amazon rainforest has intensified. Countries impacted by the pandemic may delay or cancel investments in renewable energy or climate action policies. Scientific research has been severely disrupted due to lockdowns and travel bans. And COVID-19 has also intensified the use of plastic, increasing our carbon footprint. On the reverse side, there is a silver lining behind the ominous COVID-19 cloud. It is the fact that the lockdown in countries all over the world contributed to reducing pollution and carbon emissions on a global scale never before seen since the world moved into an industrial age in the 18th century. There have been various news reports that countries which were under lockdown have seen clearer and bluer skies as manufacturing plants come to a halt and people stayed at home. Listed here are some positive impacts COVID-19 has made on the climate. The pandemic has caused changes in consumption patterns, with many adopting a buy and consume less mentality. Carbon dioxide has been reduced by 17% from January to April. Several nations have introduced green stimulus plans to tackle their ailing economies, such as the European Union, France, and South Korea. Around the world, more people have taken up biking and walking, and less international travel have reduced CO2 and nitrogen oxide emissions. The pandemic has shown that clean air and quieter cities are possible today. However, when economic activity returns to a new normal post-lockdown, all these positive changes might be wiped out. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Copernicus Climate Change Service, CO2 levels in the atmosphere will continue to increase despite the lower global emissions this year. So what can we do to try and slow down the effects of climate change and avert a potential global meltdown? The Thinking Person's Guide to Climate Change suggests that we need to combat climate change on two fronts, politically and technologically. As climate change must be dealt with on a global scale, this requires the cooperation of all nations to work towards the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. At present, fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and gas form the core of global energy supply, and they don't seem to be running out anytime soon due to new extraction technologies. So it is timely to look at alternative clean energy sources such as renewables and nuclear power. To increase energy efficiency, we can make transport greener and make the power heating and cooling systems for buildings more efficient. Geoengineering refers to using technology to tackle climate change, such as carbon dioxide removal using synthetic trees or burying them in oceans. The authors of A Bright Future believe that to avert future catastrophe, we need to rapidly reduce global carbon emissions by 2 to 3% a year. One success story is Sweden. From 1970 to 1990, Sweden cut its total carbon emissions by half. How they did it is by building carbon-free nuclear power plants. Today, 8 nuclear power plants produce 40% of Sweden's electricity, with the rest from biofuels and wind power. According to the first article, which refers to a study published by American climate mitigation research organization Project Drawdown, the tools needed to avert runaway climate change are available, established, and economically feasible today. All that is needed is more aggressive action from policymakers, businesses, and communities to deploy them at scale. The second article is from ProQuest Central, an e-journal database subscribed by the National Library. Galvanized by Greta Thunberg's idea for Friday school boycotts, climate strikes emerged in 2018 and 2019 as a form of youth social movement demanding action on climate change. According to this article, youth collective action has succeeded in highlighting global climate inaction and inertia. This study demonstrates the emergence of young people as agents of change in the global climate change arena. What is the impact of climate change on Singapore, and how are we responding to this global crisis? According to the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, the orange box highlights the climate projections for Singapore in the future. Climate change will impact our basic survival needs in these 6 areas highlighted in yellow on the right. What steps have Singapore taken to address climate change? The Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources, now renamed as the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, has published environmental blueprints such as the 1992 and 2012 Singapore Green Plans and the 2015 Sustainable Singapore Blueprint, which sets out the sustainable development strategies for Singapore until 2030. According to the National Climate Change Secretariat website, Singapore has taken early measures on sustainable development, such as managing the growth of our vehicle population and making the switch from fuel oil to natural gas. These early initiatives have helped to moderate our carbon emissions growth significantly. However, given the small size of our nation and our dense urban landscape, there are challenges to using alternative energy options like solar and wind power on an island-wide scale. So Singapore's mitigation efforts focus on improving energy efficiency to reduce emissions, and measures are being implemented across all key sectors such as power generation, industry, transport, buildings and households, as well as water and waste management. Singapore introduced a carbon tax in January 2009 and imposes a tax rate of $5 per tonne on industrial facilities that produce 25,000 tonnes and above of CO2 annually. Internationally, Singapore is part of the Paris Climate Agreement and has committed to slow down and ultimately cap our carbon dioxide emissions by around 2030. Singapore started making early preparations to adapt to the impact of climate change. The government has introduced a resilience framework to guide our efforts in safeguarding Singapore over the long term. This involves risk assessments, adaptation planning, climate projections, and climate resilience studies. Singapore has also implemented measures to protect our coastal areas, water supply, biodiversity and greenery, public health, food security, network infrastructure, and buildings from climate change. Here are some headlines of how Singapore is developing new ways to transition to a low-carbon future. In October last year, Singapore set a new target for solar energy to produce enough power by 2030 to meet the annual needs of about 350,000 households. On 18 August this year, construction began on a floating solar farm at Tengah Reservoir. Singapore has also set a target to halve its 2030 peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and to achieve net zero emissions as soon as viable in the second half of the century. To protect Singapore against rising sea levels, a $5 billion new coastal and flood protection fund will be set up. And by 2040, Singapore wants to phase out conventional vehicles that run on internal combustion engines in favor of those that run on clean energy sources instead. Climate change was a big focus of PM Lee's National Day rally speech last year. He announced that Singapore would probably need to spend 100 billion over 100 years to tackle climate change and rising sea levels. According to the CNA article, the government could fund the 100 billion cost of climate change protection using a combination of borrowing, reserves, and ministry budgets. The Bloomberg article fleshes out how a portion of the 100 billion budget will be spent. Besides the 5 billion Coastal and Flood Protection Fund, 1 billion will be committed to research in urban solutions and sustainability, focusing on such things as renewable energy and cooling. To boost resilience to floods, Singapore will spend another 400 million over the next 2 years to upgrade and maintain its drains. Singapore is also studying what the Netherlands, a similar low-lying country, is doing to guard against floods. All this attention on Singapore tackling climate change led to the first SG Climate Rally, which took place on 21st September last year. Over 1,700 participants took part to promote climate consciousness in Singapore. I would like to end my presentation with 2 quotes, which sum up the urgency for governments, corporations, and communities to recognize that we all need to band together to tackle humanity's scariest crisis. Sir David Attenborough says, "Right now we are facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon." And the former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos says, "Anybody who doesn't see the impact of climate change is really myopic. It's so evident that we are destroying Mother Earth. This is not the problem of one country or a few countries. It is the problem of mankind. We need to work together to stop this. Otherwise, our future generations will simply disappear." With this, I have come to the end of the first half of today's presentation and hope that this has been a useful overview of the resources the library has on climate change. I will now hand over to my colleague Kevin to take you through the second half of the presentation. Thank you.
My name is Kevin. I'll talk about alternative food sources and how it relates to Singapore. So I'll cover some current issues with regards to food security globally. And then I'll talk about 3 food sources. I won't spoil the surprise. You'll find out what they are later. I'll also conclude by talking about why Singapore should take note of these 3 food sources amongst the other kinds out there. Yeah. I'll conclude everything and wrap up everything by talking about the resources available at the Lee Kong Chian Reference Library. Right, so before I start, let's go on to our current issues first. So the UN definition of food security is as such: food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So the 4 main points on food security: all people should have access to it, meaning every single person at all times, be it short-term or long-term, have physical and economic access, meaning you can physically receive the food as well as fairly buy the food. And finally, to access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And this encompasses food to being able to be stored, cooked, prepared, and shared nutritiously. And what matters here would be food safety, food production, food packaging, and transport. Right, so when any one of these 4 key points are compromised, a nation is said to face food insecurity. So in 2015, the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UN has made Zero Hunger the 2nd Sustainable Development Goal to be achieved by 2030. So where are we now? So this is a 2019 hunger map of the world. The darker the color is, the higher the proportion of a country's population who do not get enough to eat. So you can see that Africa, South America, and most of Middle East and East Asia are quite affected. And the divide between the wealthy and poor is quite stark here. So according to this map, 821 million people in the world are undernourished and getting insufficient nutrition every single day. Most of them are in Asia and Africa. So if you take that into proportion, judging by the crowd today, out of everyone here, roughly about 4 to 5 people would be undernourished, meaning they don't get enough food. So the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has released a report on food security and nutrition in the world. And according to this report, 690 million people go hungry, meaning they don't even have any food at all. It's not even a matter of nourishment anymore. So this means that among the crowd here, about 3 to 4 people actually go hungry every day. And if trends continue, this number will surpass 840 billion by 2030. Meaning to say we are not on track at all. Yeah, what made it worse this time is, as you all know, COVID-19. It has potentially affected between 83 and 132 million additional people because of the way the pandemic has disrupted our lives and our food supplies worldwide. Yeah. So according to current trends as well, by 2050, there will be an additional 2 billion people in the world to feed. So the question is, how do we feed everyone on Earth sufficiently? So interestingly, on the world food hunger map, Singapore, it shows up as a gray dot, meaning data is not available. So what is the current state of Singapore? So you might have seen some of these posters in Singapore around bus stops and so on. So they posit a Singapore facing a food shortage crisis. So this is what happens if you have food shortage, shortage of flour, meaning a shortage of grains like wheat, a shortage of poultry like chicken, shortage of fish, and shortage of vegetables. So these all seem very far-fetched, but they are not actually impossible. And of course, we don't want these to ever happen. The good news is that according to the Global Food Security Index in 2019, Singapore is supposed to be the most food secure country in the world, number 1. Why is that? So that's because Singapore imports over 90% of the food we consume from over 170 countries and regions. But the fact is that Singapore is still vulnerable to global and international affairs. So Singapore, locally, we only produce 14% of all vegetables, 26% of all eggs, chicken eggs, and 10% of all fish that we currently consume in Singapore. Yeah. So if one country faces issues like bird flu or swine flu, right now we can still turn to other countries for the same product, and we have done so before. But what happens if there is a global issue that disrupts the entire food supply chain, like, for example, a global pandemic that shuts down international trade? So during the COVID-19 pandemic, global food supply chains were upended and disrupted quite drastically. Trains, ships, and plane transport all ground to a halt along with the food they transported. Food produced could not be shipped out and ended up dumped and wasted. And people started to worry about food shortage and price hikes. And we all know in Singapore, we can all remember this, that in early 2020, the supermarket shelves are all emptied out by panic buying, despite government reassurances that Singapore had sufficient food reserves at the time. So is there any good news to this? Yes, there is. So according to this research article, it is still possible for things to be turned around. However, studies show that radical societal adaptation is required to ensure this. So what I mean by that? So along in the same article, this is a chart that they have produced. This is a food budget chart. What it shows is basically the global food energy flow in terms of daily calories produced and lost during each step of the food supply chain. So from the left to right, from growth and harvesting down to transport, and finally consumption by us. So these all reveal various opportunities and potentials to work on. So for instance, you can take a look at this, and there are many losses related to harvesting and distribution and food processing during transport. And this is something that we can potentially reduce or aim to reduce. What else? We can also potentially look at the food that we use to feed our animals. So this brown section is actually plants, crops that are being grown and being fed to animals. The thing is, when an animal grows, a lot of this nutrition is lost, and the food that we actually do get out of our animals, our meat and dairy fish, is just this red section. So if we could potentially reduce this red part, we will potentially have more food. Finally, there's also food wastage. So some of us know that up to 30%, 33% of the food that we consume is actually, we get for ourselves is actually wasted and not eaten. So that's one avenue that we can potentially tackle as well. So just to take note, this entire chart is a global average. According to this chart, it looks like the food we eat actually exceeds the required intake per person. But this is a global average, meaning it does not imply that everybody in the world eats just enough and that nobody is starving. We all know this is not true. Yeah. So what I will look at is potentially to look at this part. How do we increase the food production capacity by looking at non-traditional food production? However, there are many, many people working around the globe on every single opportunity here. And if you're interested to find out more, this book, The Fate of Food by Amanda Little, was published last year and explores the current state of a wide variety of food technologies. So let's start with something very simple, very intuitive. We all know about this. Vertical farming. So what is it? So back in 1999, the idea of a vertical farm was proposed by Dr. Dixon Despomier, or rather, Despomier posed a challenge to his graduate students in medical ecology. How much food can you grow on the rooftops of New York? So he started to build on this idea and worked with many partners to come up with the concept of indoors and vertical farming. And this book, The Vertical Farm by Despomier, was published in 2010 and consolidates most of his ideas. So all sorts of buildings can actually be used, from abandoned warehouses to unused office spaces, and you just need the engineering expertise to make it work. So this is the natural progression from open farm spaces to greenhouses to indoor farming and then to vertical farming. So another book by architect Jason Pomeroy, he has worked on several ideas where he has designed future buildings that, future vertical farms that are built offshore on beaches and seas in a sense. And this can be built both vertically upwards as well as downwards into the ocean. Yeah. So why is this useful? Vertical farming technically does not require sunlight and requires very little to no soil depending on what you're trying to plant. There are many kinds of vegetables you can grow on there. Most of these tend to be leafy vegetables. So familiar vegetables like Chinese cabbage, chai sing, bok choy, they all can be grown indoors. That is also where the limitation lies, however, because there are certain staples such as rice and wheat, which require the broad space and sunlight that it cannot be possible through vertical farms and still requires open area farming. So naturally, if you are farming vertically, you can produce much more vegetable produce per land area. So from anywhere from 10 times, and some companies even report 75 times more productivity than conventional soil-based farms. So the sky literally is the limit here. So how does it work? Very simply, plants are grown in a building under very controlled conditions. So what do plants need? Plants need sunlight. Sunlight can be replaced very easily with LED lighting that feeds the specific light spectrums that the vegetable needs. Plants also need the right humidity, temperature, and wind conditions sometimes, and this can be all done with air conditioning. Plants also need soil to grow. They need some kind of medium to grow in, but is this really the case? We found that aquaponics and hydroponics can simulate soil conditions and can provide nutrients for the vegetables and plants when necessary. Plants also need to stay bug-free and pest-free. So in a closed environment, it is possible to reduce or even prevent bug infestation entirely, and no pesticides are needed. In fact, vertical farms generally produce what can be certified organic produce. So no genetically modified plants are necessary because all the hazards are protected against, and clean energy can be used to power all systems, resulting in a carbon neutral or even carbon negative building. So within the building, sensors will control the equipment to water, fertilize, and regulate the optimal growth conditions, providing what is needed when it is needed. And this reduces wastage of resources like water and fertilizer. Sensors are now so advanced that cameras can detect anomalies on individual plants, and real-time data will provide information to farmers so that potential problems can be resolved early. So all that can exist on a single shelf on a single floor. So it's just a matter of engineering ingenuity to scale this up into a building or structure with multiple floors or levels. So some examples in Singapore that's already been done. There are already companies growing plants indoors. So indoors is different from vertical farming. So you have seen you would probably have seen some of this. You might not recognize it as such, but sustainable agriculture and hydro-urban are just two local companies out of many producing indoor greenery, indoor vegetables. For large-scale vertical farming, however, there are some companies in Singapore. So Verti Veggies and Sky Greens are both situated in Lim Chu Kang, where there is enough space to scale up their production. But the technology doesn't always require non-urban landscapes. So Sky Greens on the right, you can see over here, has their 9-meter tall towers with a rainwater and gravity powered pulley system to regulate vegetable growth conditions. Why does it matter? So this concept is very important, this concept of vertical farming, because it allows us to bring vegetable farming right to our doorstep. So imagine a city like Singapore, where it's full of urban landscape throughout buildings. Since there's no open space needed, a vertical farm can theoretically be situated just a stone's throw away from supermarkets, restaurants, and homes. So what would that mean for the vegetables themselves? So this concept of food miles and the carbon footprint of food that has to travel long distances, all that can be reduced because our food is literally right next door. So imagine the amount of fuel that is needed to transport your Korean strawberries or Japanese grapes. That concept can be worked on, and these food miles can be reduced by vertical farming. Less food is also wasted because transport is shortened, so there's less contamination because the food passes through less hands, and food is now fresher because it takes less time spent in transport, and you can literally get same-day harvest vegetables and fruits. Quality control ensures controlled environments and promises cleaner produce without any additives. So such environments in turn will provide spaces for additional research, and this will in turn improve the quality of food produced in the future. So one scientific objective right now is to understand agriculture well enough so that we can make micro batches of produce with desired traits. So imagine a spinach with additional iron, or calcium-rich kale, or vitamin C-rich broccoli that's suitable for young children. So in future, you can potentially control micro batches and produce vegetables in a way that is, as Amanda Little from The Fate of Food puts it, as easy as sliding a bar on a phone app. Right, so before I move to the next one, let's just have some fun here. So let me ask, would you eat this? So would you eat this cookies? So they are chocolate chip cookies, right? No harm, right? So let me just share something I've been through. I went to Bangkok and I had a fine dining experience for 7-course meal, and these are some of the dishes. So let me see if you are interested in some of these. So I can only imagine your faces right now. And if you can't tell, these are the descriptions on the menu themselves. But right now, you should be able to tell that these are dishes made using insects. But the meal was actually quite pleasant, and insects don't need to be so overtly shown. It doesn't need to be so obvious because, for instance, the chocolate chip cookies in the first picture was actually made with cricket flour, right? So, second alternative food source, insects. So just hear me out, don't be icked out so fast. Yep, so eating of insects is called entomophagy, and this book, Eat the Beetles, it's available online. It's a good book that explores this eating habit if you like a succinct overview into this practice. So right now, there are over 2,000 insect species known to be consumed by humans, and nearly 2.5 billion people in the world already supplement their diet with insects. So if you've ever been to Thailand, if you've ever been to Bangkok and you see the street markets, you might see something like this where insects are sold openly. Yeah, so how does insect farming compare with traditional farming? So, and there are really many reasons to consider insect farming. The FAO has already published reports about edible insects as a means of food production and a way to buffer food security. So insects have a high feed conversion ratio, meaning it takes less feed to produce 1 kg of crickets than it does for chicken, pigs, and cows, and so on. And consider that this includes the non-edible parts like bones and the offal. And you realize that there's much value in eating crickets. Insects are also usually eaten whole. About 80% of the cricket is digestible compared to much less for chickens, pigs, and cows, meaning you get less wastage of food. Insects overall have higher protein content, contain all the amino acids we need as in our diet, and it's generally very high in minerals and vitamins, such as calcium, zinc, magnesium, omega-369, fiber, and various vitamins. So how does insect production work? It's very simple. It takes just around 5 steps, and call these the 5 Ps. So first, production. Insect farms are used to breed insects under controlled and hygienic conditions. It may not look so hygienic, but it could be a lot worse. So all these are used to maximize yield and nutrition. And there is ample research done into, for example, the best temperature and humidity to maximize yield of crickets in a farm. Yep, and a lot of research goes into the optimal conditions. So next, once the insects are mature, they are processed and prepared. And these are either whole as they are, insect form, or processed into a form that's unrecognizable. And usually this tends to be in a flour, powder kind of form. This is a food additive. Products are then packaged in, and this will follow the relevant food safety standards as per any food product you get out there. This ensures that the food is free from contamination and has a long shelf life. Products are then shipped out to businesses and consumers to use, and some of them produce secondary food products. Like here, you get cookies, snacks, and so on. And then finally, the final products are purchased by consumers to be eaten. Some examples of insects out there. In Vietnam, there's a company called Cricket One. They farm and produce cricket flour. And did you know that crickets can also be used to make oil? This cricket oil can be used for cooking and so on. The restaurant I just mentioned is called Insects in the Backyard. It's in Thailand and it serves fine dining dishes made by incorporating insects into the food. In Thailand as well, there's a company called Hiso. It produces packet snacks made of silkworms, crickets, and bamboo worms, and these are eaten whole. And just over the Indian Ocean, in South Africa, there is a company making gluten and lactose-free ento milk, which is milk basically made from black soldier fly larvae, and you can make ice cream from that milk. So there are many food products that can be made with insects, and it's really up to your imagination. So beer, bread, candy, and so on. And this may first sound like something that maybe a backwards country might be looking into, but no. The insect products are already present in USA, UK, and many of these wealthy countries. Why does insect production matter? Basically, insect farms already take up less space by nature of their farming. So they require 1.5 to 3.5 times less land to farm than chickens and pigs, and 10 times less than cattle, which is what where we get our beef from. Rearing insects also uses less water. Just a very simple gauge is to consider how much water an insect has compared to any animal with blood. And in fact, insects require very little water to survive compared to livestock. And very importantly as well, insects produce much less wastewater and less greenhouse gases. So this means less pollution and less of a contribution to climate change. This graph over here shows that mealworms actually take up almost 100 times less in terms of greenhouse gas and ammonia. Insects also reproduce relatively quickly. It takes about 6 weeks for crickets to mature, whereas it takes about 8 to 12 weeks for chickens and more for cattle. This means shorter turnaround time between batches of food. And beyond food production, insects generally, you won't face any ethical concerns which you might get from factory farming of animals. Genetically, insects are also quite distant from us, which means that you are less likely to get any insect-borne diseases as compared to something like swine flu or bird flu. So third, and our final alternative food source is something some might call frankenfood, but it's something that Singapore can really pursue and research on. Lab-grown meat, lab-grown produce. So what is it? Traditionally, farming methods require farmers to grow, feed, cultivate, nurture, and finally slaughter living animals to produce the meat we eat. And such practices always pose many questions, many issues from ethical to environmental. So chicken is grown and slaughtered to create this southern fried chicken, and a duck is farmed to produce the roast duck in orange sauce over here. But what if we could create the same dish without these issues? So lab-grown produce allows us to manufacture the same food products using animal cells without any of the cruel factory farms, without loss of nutrients, without manual labor. And stem cells are the core of this technology because these cells are the ones that will convert into every other kind of living cell, such as muscles, fats, bones, glands, etc. And once extracted, a stem cell line can technically ensure a constant supply with no animal being harmed after that. Animal products are materially identical to these farm and processed products because if you can't tell, but these two products here, these two chicken and duck, were actually made by Memphis Meats, which is a company that produces lab-grown meat. Yeah. So how does it work? I've extracted this infographic from the Street Science, which summarizes it quite well. So first, stem cells are extracted from animals. These are generally either through adults, embryos, or eggs. And once that's done, as I mentioned, the stem cell line can be created and cultivated, providing theoretically an unlimited supply of stem cells. Then the cells are fed using a cell culture media, and this is basically food for the cells to grow and multiply. And the main thing is that the main expense in lab-grown meat lies here because culture media is very expensive to produce now due to the lack of scale and the cost of production. But scientists are working on producing cheaper and more sustainable culture media using plant material. So in future, this might change. Growing cells are placed in a bioreactor where they will grow even more quickly and in controlled environments. And once ready, the cells are mixed in with other ingredients and with tissue engineering made to look and feel like real meat. So all these are done in laboratory conditions, but it is essentially what our human body cells are doing in their our cells are living cells that eat and grow basically. So because everything is done in a controlled environment, these cells are not exposed to external risks and hazards. So you don't need genetic modification, you don't need hormone injections to enhance growth, because all these cells are already provided the optimal growth conditions. You don't need antibiotics or vaccines as well, because the cells will never be exposed to diseases, and any compromised batches will be disposed of immediately. So some examples of lab-grown produce. Memphis Meats in the USA, which I mentioned before. They're based in San Francisco and they're exploring beef, chicken, and duck meat. Finless Foods, also in San Francisco, is exploring cultured fish products, and these two companies are part of a 7-company alliance for meat, poultry, and seafood innovation, and they advocate and advance cell-based agriculture. So even in Singapore, we are exploring such meats as well. Willow Tree Labs in Singapore aims to produce milk and milk products and has even a concept for human breast milk. And Shiok Meats is a company that within 18 months of their startup managed to produce viable shrimp meat from shrimp cells and have created their own siomai even. So Dr. Sandhya Sriram is the CEO and co-founder of Shiok Meats. She has spoken at our prominent speaker series, and you can find this session at our YouTube channel as well. So why does lab-grown produce matter? Bill Gates said there is no way to produce enough meat for 9 billion people, and yet we can't ask everyone to become vegetarians. So this lab-grown produce is one alternative source which can be sustainable for our future. Beyond production, why does this technology matter? You may have heard many concerns regarding animal welfare, the cruelties of factory farming, and even psychological harms to slaughterhouse employees. But all this is circumvented by this technology because no animal is harmed or slaughtered. Next, there have been many food scares due to contamination of meat. So your bird flu, your swine flu, salmonella, E. coli, all these contaminants can cause all sorts of health issues, but lab-grown produce avoids all this because the environment is closed and there is an ability to track and monitor the produce every step of the way. Lab-grown produce, as suggested, grows in a lab. So you take substantially less space than open farms. You don't need pasture, you don't need water troughs, no barns or coops necessary. And this frees up a lot of land for other developments. So remember this food budget map? So we can focus on this area here, as mentioned. Lab-grown produce will aim to increase our this little red part of the pie while reducing the need for all this brown section. And this actually increases 2 sources of food, increases the red part as well as the green part. So as research continues to drive costs down and there are sufficient breakthroughs, we might be able to push this into the market soon. To be clear, these foods will not replace our staple meats, but at the very least take a bit less of a toll on Mother Nature. So why should Singapore care about these alternative food sources? Singapore is aiming to produce 30% of our nutritional needs by 2030. This is our notorious 30 by 30 goal. And this will require technologies that can be implemented within our land scarce and resource tight spaces. So the 3 technologies I mentioned augment what we already currently produce and do not take up much land area. So we don't need large spaces like Lim Chu Kang, and this will preserve a lot of other spaces for national development. However, these technologies will not be the silver bullets to provide complete food security for Singapore. These are just technologies that we can work on to augment what we have. Nonetheless, these are technologies that are worth exploring, implementing, and incubating in Singapore. And if not for the food production purposes, then for food science research. So institutions such as A*STAR's Bioprocessing Technology Institute here are first movers in culturing meat and are pushing the boundaries of food science and technology. And with our scientific expertise, the research can be exported to the rest of the world to contribute in solving our global food crisis. So to sum up, in the last hour, Sharon has shared on the causes and effects of climate change, the impact of COVID-19 on the climate change solutions, and its relevance in Singapore in terms of mitigation and adaptation plans. I have provided a brief overview in the global food crisis and Singapore's food security concerns. I have mentioned 3 alternative food sources for Singapore to take note of: vertical farming, insects, and lab-grown produce. And considering Singapore's context, these are food sources worth exploring to support Singapore's 30 by 30 food supply goal. Beyond this, the National Library has many print and digital resources on climate change, and Sharon has highlighted just a few of them. As for food technology, these are still relatively new and research is still being done, which means there may not be that many books on these technologies, but there are plenty of websites and articles covering these fronts. Books on climate change and food technology can be found at level 7, 8, and 11 of the Lee Kong Chian Reference Library, whereas we also provide e-resources such as e-books, e-journals, and e-newspaper databases accessible via NLB's website. Online and free for you to access, there's tons of information on climate change and food issues, from reports and studies done by research institutes, think tanks, and universities, to conference papers, journal articles, and so on, published by scientists, climatologists, and academics. Although Google research will review many of such websites, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, as well as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, would be the best place and the first place to look for authoritative and updated information. If you are not interested in reading so much, there are other online mediums which deliver current information, such as podcasts on climate, like climate changes, as well as Agri Matters, which covers food technology and agriculture technology. And all this you can listen to while on the go.